Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Decoupling Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Nikos Tsafos, and I'm the Interim Director and a Senior Fellow with the Energy Security and Climate Change Program here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I am so pleased to welcome you to a conversation today about supply chains for clean energy. This conversation is based on a report that the team at CSIS put out last week, talking about the sort of threat landscape, as well as putting forward some recommendations about how the United States and other countries can think about strengthening and improving the resilience of supply chains for clean energy technologies. We have with us two superb panelists to talk with me about this report. We have Laszlo Varro, who is the chief economist with the International Energy Agency, and we have our very own Sarah Ladislaw. We couldn't have her be away for so long, so we wanted her back, also a co-author of the report. What we're going to do is I'm going to spend maybe 10 minutes up front talking about why we did this report, what we found, and then we're going to get into a conversation. You can use the Q&A function to shoot a question our way. We're going to have a lot of time for conversation, so I'm really hoping to be able to bring some of your questions into the conversation as they make sense. So with that, let's start off by talking a little bit about our report. So our report, as I said, we put it out last Wednesday. It looks like this. If we go to the next slide, this is the cover, and it's about 50 pages. It's on the CSIS website. And it also, we published alongside an accompanied slide deck by our colleagues at Bloomberg NEF. We asked them to look at some of the cost implications of trade disputes and possible strategies for reshoring to help us understand essentially how much of that, of those barriers and challenges that we had addressed in the report, what impact they might have on the deployment of clean energy technology. This project sort of is phase 2 of a report we did back in February that we released also alongside 6 shorter reports from Bloomberg NEF. We had an event back then as well. That first report was really talking about the history and the evolution of clean energy supply chains. This report was focused a lot more on understanding the threat landscape, digging deeper, and also outlining strategies for how we might think about how to manage those challenges. So what is the point of departure for this report? We wanted to, if we go to the next slide, we wanted to sort of begin from a number of observations. And apologies, some of these are obviously familiar to you, but I just think it's helpful to understand where we're coming from. Number one is that clean energy technologies are no longer niche. Consumers and companies are spending hundreds of billions of dollars. Investment in solar and wind and efficiency in electric vehicles exceeds $600 billion. And of course, if we are to meet our targets either under the Paris Agreement or the more stringent sort of net zero by 2050 goals that, say, the International Energy Agency put out last week, we know that these numbers will have to become bigger and bigger. We see the ambition from countries around the world wanting to be net zero by 2050. A number of countries have committed to it, are planning to commit to it, are talking about committing to it. The world is going towards that direction. Now, one of the features of supply chains for clean energy technology has been that they've been global. Our ability to lower the cost of solar, to lower the cost of wind, to lower the cost of electric for batteries for electric vehicles has all dependent on global supply chains of production, manufacturing in one part of the world, components shipping across oceans, and shipping to a third or fourth country for assembly. But those trade relationships have been contested from the beginning. We've had trade disputes, not least between the United States and China, but also with Europe, with India, with other major suppliers, as countries try to incentivize their own industries, protect their own firms, impose local content and other rules. But even so, renewable energy is a big export market. We put this number in the report that the World Trade Organization says solar and solar-related goods are about $300 billion of exports. You add electric vehicles and hybrids, you add wind, you get close to $400 billion of exports. These are big numbers, and I put here for reference, OPEC earned $565 billion selling oil and oil products in 2019. LNG is a $150 billion market, right? So we're talking about a big, big market. And that means that it's going to get entangled into the trade conversations more broadly. And of course, at the heart of this is that China has emerged as the key supplier for some of these technologies. And what that means is that countries are thinking about their dependence on these technologies, not just generally, but also their dependence on China. Let's go to the next slide. So how do we respond to this strategic reality? Number one is we don't think that the messiness, for lack of a better word, of the energy transition is a reason not to do it. If the argument is, well, we don't want to advantage China, or we expose ourselves to vulnerabilities, or we may be supporting sort of child labor or forced labor, we don't think that those challenges are reasons not to engage in the energy transition. We just have to be smart about how we do it. But we also don't think it's right to go the other extreme, which is to say, well, it's clean, it's low carbon, therefore don't worry about it. We don't think that's the right approach either. These vulnerabilities are real, we have to take them seriously. And finally, we don't think that sort of a desire to decouple from China, to say that a lot of the problems that come from China, let's just forget about them, we're going to do our own thing. That is neither, we think, realistic or probably cost effective in the near term, at least. So a big part of this report talks about how we have dealt, the United States and its allies, we have dealt with these challenges for a very long time. We've been importing oil and gas and coal and trading in nuclear and uranium for decades. And so our big argument in this report is we know how to solve a lot of these problems: supply concentration, supply diversification, reshoring. Why don't we take some of those lessons from the past and adapt them to the realities of clean energy supply chains? And so we thought we could summarize this entire sort of strategy into 3 words: reshore, reroute, rebalance. So let me go through each one of those 3 very quickly. And let's start with reshore. Reshoring means that you have a big market. For the United States, that's a precondition for clean energy. And you have the industrial base to supply that market. How do you create that market? We know. We know how to do rules, targets and mandates, taxes on externalities, financial incentives, nudges, government procurement strategies, leveling the playing field for low carbon technologies, government investments to create markets. We have decades and decades of experience of how we create markets for clean energy technologies. The only question is at what scale, how quickly, and what is the political appetite to do some of these things versus others. But I think one of the key elements of thinking about reshoring is we don't want to have a very narrow view of reshoring, which is to say we are competing for the next factory or the next installation. Where is the next factory for wind blades going to be built? Is it going to be here, or is it going to be in Beijing, as the president likes to say? I think the question is broader, which is how do you shape a system that is more amenable to you and where you are more secure? So to give an example from the hydrocarbon era, switching from imported oil to domestic gas is a reshoring strategy. Obviously, producing more oil domestically is a reshoring strategy, but so is shifting the system to technologies that you are more secure in. And we think, and that's part of the analysis that we did with Bloomberg NEF, is that the costs that are involved in reshoring some of these key technologies only have a small impact on cost. And because of the underlying cost decline in these technologies, it doesn't really slow down your decarbonization plans by any significant amount. And that's something we can talk about more. And finally, and this is a key point, we have a large number of technologies that we are trying to develop to reach sort of net neutrality over the next 30 years. Yes, you may say that China has built a commanding lead in solar photovoltaics, but that's no reason to either just try to copy China or to say, well, that's the whole game. No, there's a lot of technologies. In most of these technologies, there's no clear global leader. So it's really about thinking not just how do you replicate or how do you copy or how do you catch up with China, but look at the whole suite of technologies and thinking, where can I compete? Where do I have a competitive advantage? And putting resources behind those technologies. That's idea number 1, reshore. Idea number 2 is reroute. Again, this, for folks that have dealt with energy security issues in the past, is incredibly familiar. You want to trade with countries that don't have geopolitical baggage. You want to trade with countries that don't make you insecure. To give a simple example, the U.S. has always been very concerned about imports of Middle Eastern oil. It's never been concerned about imports of Canadian gas, right? Because Canada brings different geopolitical connotations than Middle Eastern oil. We've seen these strategies employed by the Europeans in diversifying their gas sources away from Russia. We've seen this in the Japanese that basically went out and built an entire LNG industry in Southeast Asia in the aftermath, and in Australia in the aftermath of the 1973 and 79 oil crises. So we know what this means. It means going out and trying to actively encourage diverse supply sources. And it means using tools like the Export-Import Bank and the Development Finance Corporation to say, let's try to build a solar supply chain, not in the US, because that may not be competitive, but why don't we do it in Southeast Asia? Why do we do it in Sub-Saharan Africa? Why don't we do it in the Americas? So it's bringing that lens of, it doesn't all have to be here within the United States. You can also actively shape these supply chains in order to be located in countries that are more favorable to you. So that's strategy number 3. The final strategy is rebalance. And this is recognizing that no matter what you do, you're going to be exposed to a certain amount of vulnerability. You're going to be exposed to a certain amount of import dependence, including on countries that you may not want. Again, if we could give the oil example, President Nixon said he wanted the country to be energy independent in 1973. We sort of reached that target in 2019 if you measure it in the context of self-sufficiency. It took a long time, right? So if you begin with the reshoring is the only strategy, it may take you a very long time and you may never be able to get there. So you also need a strategy to manage the relationships that do exist. So number 1, we think it's very important to delineate threats clearly. We do have a tendency, especially in this town in Washington, to say that because the Chinese are doing something, or because the Chinese are producing something, or because we're importing commodities from a specific place, that implies a vulnerability. That's not always true, or at least it's helpful to understand what vulnerability really exists and what threat might be possibly inflated. But then we see a number of strategies that have been employed during the hydrocarbon era that could have relevance for today's world, creating interdependencies. These are times when suppliers have invested in consuming countries and consumers have invested in supply countries as a way to sort of create ballast to weather crises. We can use, of course, international institutions that we have developed, whether that is the International Energy Agency, which obviously is doing a lot of work in this space and thinking about critical minerals and other supply chains, the Energy Charter Treaty, a number of organizations, the Extractive Transparency Initiative, a number of organizations that we have built up over time to deal with various aspects of insecurity in the hydrocarbon era. We can either repurpose those or think about what new ones we may want to create. Using institutions to shape the behavior of suppliers. In this country, we've always used the threat of the NOPEC Act to sort of try to pressure OPEC suppliers. Europe has used antitrust law to deal with Gazprom and other suppliers. So countries have always used the power of domestic law, which rests on being a big market, to shape what is acceptable or not acceptable for new suppliers. We think some of those ideas have relevance for the clean energy era. Building strategic buffers, again, that is something that we need to sort of think about and map more clearly. We probably don't want to create big stockpiles of everything, but trying to be strategic and understanding in what areas and what minerals and what technologies, or also what manufacturing processes and routes might it be necessary to incentivize resilience and diversification in order to be able to withstand a shock. And finally, of course, there's going to be deterrence. At the end of the day, one of the main reasons why people or countries don't engage in or don't attack each other is because they fear the consequences. And at the end of the day, this is going to be one area, especially the area of cyber, which we will talk about, where the ability of the United States to deter adversaries will be a crucial element of a strategic response. So that's the report. It's a 50-something page report, which I try to summarize in about 10 minutes. So there's a lot more in there. But the idea is, doesn't mean that the messiness is no reason to stay away, but you have to take that stuff seriously. And there's a rich history of dealing with energy security that we have employed over, decades, for some countries, multi-decades. Learn from that history, adapt it, and think about what you've learned in order to deal with the challenges that we're going to face over the next 20 and 30 years. So with that, let me stop with the presentation and turn to my fellow panelists, Laszlo Varro and Sarah Ladislaw, to begin a conversation. Laszlo, let me begin with you. And I want to start from sort of the genesis of this report, which was, us sitting here in Washington and hear the word decoupling mentioned over and over again. And you don't hear it as much maybe in the Biden administration, but you do hear the president frame sort of the push for domestic manufacturing and for clean energy in the context of the competition with China. Again, this is not a new thing. We've heard, Middle Eastern oil has always been a shorthand for energy security. In Europe, Russian gas has always been shorthand for how you think about energy security. But maybe start with you talking to us about how realistic is decoupling from China, how useful of a frame it is, and is this really sort of a zero-sum thinking, a useful construct for how we should be framing our thinking on clean energy supply chains?
So, Nikos, thank you very much for the invitation. And you kindly mentioned the net zero roadmap, which the IEA published last week, and we regard that as a major milestone in our involvement in the energy transition conversation. And let me quote an important sentence from this report, that an analysis such as that is always based on a certain set of technological, policy, social, and political assumptions, some of which might be challenging. In fact, a lot of them are challenging, given that the net zero in 2050 is a challenging target. So the sentence I would like to quote is that the unprecedented level of international cooperation between governments. This is the founding assumption of the trajectory that we did. We even run an alternative scenario with limited international cooperation. And our original intention was that to show that with limited international cooperation, the transition will be more expensive. We actually came to the conclusion that with limited international cooperation, the transition is simply impossible. We could not make the numbers add up with limited international cooperation. Now, so I would like to emphasize that we are facing a global problem, and it's inconceivable to tackle this global problem without global cooperation. Now, of course, at the same time, the IEA was founded by Henry Kissinger. We are not a naive organization, so we understand some of the complicated foreign policy issues that are underlying this. But overall, one point we have to recognize that perhaps the best news from a clean energy climate point of view was the radical technological improvements and the radical cost declines of solar. Now, but we also have to acknowledge that when we celebrate the success of solar, we are not celebrating the R&D programs of the US Department of Energy. Those were useful, but overall secondary. We are not celebrating by brilliant Silicon Valley venture capital investors. That was useful, but overall secondary. What we are celebrating with the success of solar is mass manufacturing in China. So the single biggest news, biggest positive news was largely achieved by the Chinese industry setting up their solar value chain. I think this should be acknowledged. One thing that you didn't write in this report, and it's also a very interesting topic in my view, is third countries, other developing and emerging economies. So I have to say that in a lot of them, China is not simply exporting and investing to the United States. In fact, that's minor relatively. What is much more important is the Chinese investments in other emerging economies. Now, there's a lot of discussion about Chinese coal investments, but in fact, the clean energy component of the Belt and Road Initiative is actually rapidly increasing. Hydropower, solar, wind, electricity networks, you name it. So I think that there will be a significant number of emerging and developing economies where the on-the-ground reality of the energy transition is going to be Chinese solar panels and the Chinese-built hydropower plant charging Chinese electric buses and Chinese electric scooters through a Chinese-built smart grid, with the locals having some vague recollection that the Europeans and the Americans making some speeches in international summits. So that's I think part of the reality of the energy transition. So overall, I think your report did a very, very good job in laying out the different issues, and I think we need to make a clear distinction whether we discuss China or whether we discuss any other country. We need to have to make a clear distinction between things that are potential security concerns, that we don't want to rely on this country or this technology because of security concerns, and things that are economic concerns. In the case of the security, of course, equipment is very different than a fuel that you have to burn. And there, I think the bigger discussion is passive or active equipment. So for a solar panel has no moving parts. You put it up and it just simply produces direct current electricity. And it's difficult to see why it would be a problem where that solar panel is coming from. Whereas very often there's an emerging, very exciting technology area, smart inverters, which enable to use power electronics to use that direct current electricity actually to provide frequency control in the power system. I think it is a legitimate question to ask what type of cybersecurity standards you have on those smart inverters, what type of manufacturers can provide over their upgrades, who can control the system, and so on. But even in that case, I think you also, that's not necessarily an argument for autarky. For example, Japanese companies build very sophisticated smart grid systems in the United States, and I think it would be very difficult to argue why a Japanese IT company is any different concern than a domestic company. Whereas for economics, of course, there is a lot of excitement about green jobs and domestic clean energy manufacturing. Now, the sad fact is that there is a very limited demand for wind turbines and solar panels in Mars. So you cannot have everybody exporting clean energy equipment. Now, every country would like to be an exporter of clean energy equipment, but you cannot have everybody becoming a net exporter. And in other parts, in the conventional energy sector, several countries have experimented with local content requirements in the conventional energy sector. There is a library of literature about them. So we know that with local content requirements, there is an exactly 100% likelihood that projects will become more expensive. And there is an exactly 100% likelihood that it will be slower to scale up the value chains. And this really matters, because I should emphasize that in our net zero roadmap, even in the case of onshore wind and solar PV, which are the most mature technologies and where the narrative is very often that this is now a done deal, even in solar PV and onshore wind, we have annual deployment rates increasing by a factor of 4 in just 9 years. And we consulted with major manufacturers of how long it takes to build a wind turbine factory, what type of skilled labor you require, what type of infrastructure, specialized equipment, and so on. And even for wind and solar PV, scaling it up to the necessary deployment level is going to be a major task. Now, for batteries and electricity storage technologies, we are talking about a scale up by a factor of 20, and in hydrogen-related technologies by 3 orders of magnitude. So we think that policymakers should be careful interfering with the global clean energy supply chains. This global cooperation and global cooperation on technology, innovation, and investment is necessary. Now, we do acknowledge that there might be legitimate security concerns, but we think that governments should be careful not to go beyond the absolutely necessary concerns.
Well, thank you, Laszlo. You brought up about 4 things that I wanted to come back to. Both on the inverter side, on security versus economics, local content. So lots of stuff to come back to and talk about. But Sarah, let me start off with you again on that same question on sort of decoupling and how you're thinking about that question.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's great to be back and always good to be involved in a discussion with you and Laszlo. Congratulations to everybody for putting the report out. It's pretty timely, so I think that's always a good sign. So on decoupling, I think we've talked about this different times. What's interesting to me is that the sort of analogy between the oil and gas industry and thinking about the clean tech scale up world that we're moving into is they both sort of suffer from this fallacy of independence, right? And I think that Laszlo was talking about that in some detail, but it's really important to think about, at this particular moment in time, not only is it not possible or probable that we would be able to decouple from, particularly China when it comes to thinking about these technologies, but it's also not desirable, right? So when you think about what it actually means to achieve those ends that we're aiming for in a net zero by 2050, 1.5 degree sort of aligned world, it is really imperative that we get folks swimming in the same direction. And so while this competition with China narrative in the United States in particular is very compelling, we have to remember that just as it was the case in the energy security days of oil and gas, it's really important that we don't interpret that as like a whack-a-mole dynamic, right? It's not that we need to take people who are our competitors and try to do something punitive. It's that we need to do a better job competing, right? And so I think that the more appropriate framing here is to think about, what does productive competition look like, right? What does it look like to, as obviously, have to manage sort of the security and human rights issues, as Laszlo said, there's some very legitimate things to watch out for there. But the real question is like, how do you actually try and think about ways in which everybody is becoming a better actor in this space and everybody is doing more to, ramp up their own activity, whether it's on the R&D side, whether it's on the demonstration side, whether it's on the manufacturing side. And I think that's a really important thing for us to think about in the US policy context. It is not necessarily about, how can we make ourselves independent from or insulated from what's going on with China, or to, we do have to think about sort of resilience within those supply chains. But the most important part of that is upping our own game to do a better job here in the United States of producing the things that we want to produce and being able to have the sort of supply and demand side policies that make that all possible. So, and I think that Laszlo raised a really important, separate question, which is how are we working in third countries around the world to be able to deploy these technologies, right? Whether it's China, whether it's us, whether it's another country, like how are we working to make sure that these technologies are getting into other markets as quickly as possible? And so I do think that the decoupling framing or the sort of competition with China framing does get a lot of airtime in US policy conversations, and for good reason. But the most important part of that is what are we going to do to be a better competitor? And you think about professional sports, right? Some of the best athletes that we have in the world will say about their rivals, they'll be like, they made me better, right? That made me a better player. That's the kind of dynamic that we need here, as opposed to thinking about, what we need to do to separate ourselves from each other.
Well, so let me pull up and pick up on an element of that, which is, a lot of this project originated in our observation about trade and trade disputes, right? That, the United States definitely tried to use tariffs to protect domestic solar manufacturing. The Chinese retaliated by attacking US polysilicon. We've had trade disputes in wind and in batteries. And one of the things that I guess we really found out, or one of the things we concluded, was that, they added some cost, these trade disputes. They led to some rerouting, particularly of Chinese manufacturing to Southeast Asia. They didn't really save the US solar production manufacturing industry. And so, I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit your thoughts on, how should we think of trade as an instrument of policy in this space?
Yeah, this was a particularly tricky one because I do think, one of the assumptions or one of the things you have to think about is when you look back at the historical incidents of, trade tools being used to protect a domestic market or to retaliate against somebody else's domestic market choices when it comes to promoting clean energy technology is, will the past sort of look like the future? You know, and that was something I think that was actually quite hard to grapple with in the report, which is if we're going to be in a much more trade tense world, and in a world where there's more countries trying to protect and develop their own domestic industries, and quite frankly, if we do start to see the type of investment that you would see in a world headed legitimately towards a net zero by 2050 environment, you know, the big question for me is, what would those trade dynamics look like? And could they be vastly different from what we've seen in the past? So that, I still think that that's an open question. I think that's worth, you know, policymakers continuing to think about the intersection between climate change and the trade realm, which is something that we've written about in another report as well. On the historical experience, though, you know, I think you're right. It's not to say that trade measures had no consequence. They just didn't have a consequence that stopped the sort of development of these supply chains. And I think that, you know, we learned a lot of lessons about the trade measures can just be added cost, right? They can fail to achieve your strategic objective as a country. They can absolutely not wreak the harm that you think that they're going to wreak on the country that they're intended to affect. And they can have all of these other consequences. And so I think we need to start thinking about them in those terms rather than sort of the binary kind of tit for tat way that we've been thinking about them over the history of the development of this industry.
Laszlo, let me turn to you on, you mentioned also sort of local content in your first observation, but I wanted to maybe make a more general comment from you, get a more general comment from you on, you know, the trade-off between reshoring and decarbonization, right? And how we should be thinking about that. I mean, one of the, you know, the math that we did with Bloomberg and EF showed that, you know, like if you were to replicate some of these supply chains in the United States, you know, again, questions about what that cost structure looks like, but that maybe doesn't add that much. But as you say, you know, we have a long history of experience with local content, and in general, it's been mixed to negative, I would say, in terms of the success of countries to really develop domestic industries. But also, I guess, you know, it might be different. It might be different if you're trying to reshore or build up a, you know, domestic geothermal industry in the United States than if you're trying to do solar, right? So maybe how should we be thinking about reshoring and decarbonization and the trade-off between them, and how it might, how that trade-off might be different in different technologies?
So, because I have to say that I found this BNEF analysis to be too optimistic. So I haven't seen the exact technological assumptions behind it, but you know, this notion that squeezing out China from the solar value chain would knock back the solar tipping point only by 1 year, it doesn't feel realistic. You know, this very radical cost declines that we observed by solar panels, I mean, this was not a gift from God. So this was a result of building up a very impressive integrated value chain, you know, polysilicon manufacturing, modules, cells, panels, dozens of specialized companies, a handful of large integrated companies who have vertically integrated value chains, quite significant scale funding by big state-owned banks in China. I think replicating that, I don't believe it would take only 1 year. So I would caution about this conclusion. I think what for me is a very interesting historical experiment is that when renewables started in Western Europe, countries like Germany, there were nearly identical policies adopted on promoting wind deployment and promoting solar deployment. A decade later, we observe that countries like Germany have a flourishing wind turbine industry, and their solar panel industry is dead and buried. And I think the reason for this is the good old school Ricardian theory of comparative advantages that every economist is supposed to believe in after undergraduate course. You know, a wind turbine is a piece of mechanical engineering. It's a rotating machine. And companies like Siemens, who spent 100 years manufacturing rotating machines based on mechanical engineering, had a natural competitive advantage, and they could rely on the cluster of suppliers and the skilled labor, and they quite naturally transitioned themselves to be extremely successful wind turbine manufacturers. Whereas a solar panel is a semiconductor electronics, which are very similar to something like manufacturing mobile phones, where China happens to have a competitive advantage, cluster effects, skilled labor, existing suppliers, and so on. So for me, one interesting question is to what extent this issue, this reshoring value chains issue, would lead us to change our energy transition strategy. So for example, when you run a quote unquote conventional energy system model, that would tell you that in the United States, solar will play a very, very big role, and advanced geothermal might play some role, but a very small role. Now, do we want to say that, well, advanced geothermal is a type of technology where you need geophysics and subsurface engineering? The American oil and gas industry is just completely unbeatable in that. So if or when advanced geothermal plays a major role, it's almost certain to be a technology to be dominated by American companies. So consequently, we actually change our energy transition strategy and give a bit more emphasis on this technology, because I think that's a very interesting question. Because in conventional energy system models, we don't incorporate this type of considerations. But of course, once you have the transition becoming an all-government effort, I think that can come a topic of legitimate discussion.
No, thank you for bringing that up. And I think when we talked about reshoring being not just competing straight on the precise commodity, but really shaping the system in a way where you advantage fuels that you have a competitive advantage in, I think that's exactly the kind of logic that we had in mind. So I appreciate you bring that. Sarah, did you want to say something on that reshoring and decarbonization trade-off?
Yeah, just maybe to make a add on to the last point that Laszlo made, which is I do think, we all, and I think we've made this point in the first session on the first report, but we all have spent a lot of time thinking about optimized decarbonization pathways, right? And they're just technology and cost optimized with some policy and other things in place. And I think the net zero report put out by the IEA and a lot more analysis is starting to change things a bit, right? And it looks a lot more at some of these issues about, where can you be competitive? Where are you creating jobs? Where are you solving equity issues? And that's shaping a lot of the types of policies and investments that are going into different countries. I mean, another question, which I think is important is, where do you want to build new areas of competency and competitiveness? Like, this is not a short-term exercise that we're going through. And so there's a lot of thinking about what a more holistic approach to thinking about deep decarbonization pathways and what kind of industry and domestic economic and political sort of institutions and communities that you want to have around this transition. And I think that does look vastly different than we're typically used to having these types of conversations. And as you said, it is framing the dialogue around the policies that are put in place. And I think that that's going to have a lot of implications for what ultimately gets reshored and how we think about decarbonization pathways. I would say the US has traditionally had a relatively standoffish approach to thinking about where we can compete, right? And saying, hey, we'd like to compete here, or we think we can compete here from a policy and government standpoint, right? We think that we're supposed to sort of create this market and then companies are supposed to solve that problem. And I think by and large that can be true, but I think we're now in a phase of saying maybe that government policy interface is going to be a bit closer for a while, because making decisions about where you want to compete is a bit more active on the government side than we have, traditionally treated it over the last several decades.
Well, let me build up on that. Let me turn to you, Laszlo, because I think one of the, again, sort of starting points of this report in our conversation was this idea that as you scale up ambition and as you frame your ambition in the context of competitiveness as well as meeting a climate target, you are invariably going to a system that is a lot more so state directed, right? Where you kind of have the state steering the ship and saying, these are the technologies, these are the tools, these are the manufacturing areas where we want to play in. So maybe stepping back a little bit, I mean, and I think this builds up on what Sarah was saying before about the trade disputes, right? That the trade disputes of the past may not be a perfect sort of mirror of the trade disputes we may have in the future, both because our understanding of the trading system and our appetite for, unhindered trade may be changing, but also because the scale of government intervention may be changing as well, right? If we do have governments that are making more significant investments and steps to steer energy systems. So Laszlo, maybe helping us think about sort of the overarching sort of macro picture of state intervention, industrial policy, and how we should be thinking about that in the terms of the pace of decarbonization, geography of supply demand, as well as sort of trade disputes or other disputes.
So we believe that something like a net zero 2050, it has to be an all government effort. So the conventional measures of energy policy are very much relevant. So we have carbon pricing in this roadmap, even in the United States. So we have investment policies and various regulatory measures that encourage the growth of renewables and also the reform of energy systems. But we also have infrastructure policy. A massive scale expansion of the electricity infrastructure and the adjacent infrastructure like electric car chargers. New infrastructure elements like carbon dioxide and hydrogen pipelines, and also quite significant changes in the transport infrastructure, mass transit, high-speed trains, as also all other things which ease the burden for transport decarbonization. And last but not least, we also have innovation policy. So we have a significant expansion of both R&D funding and also, very importantly, funding of early deployment, because some of the most important energy technologies are right now in the Valley of Death. That laboratory R&D actually has done its job, but we just have to say that, okay, rock and roll, I'm going to spend $50 billion on early deployment, and that's also an important part. Now we are very much aware that there is a very strong social and political desire for green jobs. So there's no doubt that a positive employment story strongly reinforces the social and political chances of the transition. Now, we think that in most regions and most societies, this is achievable because the transition will require a lot of very labor-intensive local activity, especially related to the building sector. So we should not put excessive emphasis only on equipment manufacturing. In fact, in the United States, if you're a middle-class family and you put solar panels on your rooftop, you will spend more money on American lawyers than on Chinese solar panels. So a lot of American lawyers actually have a green job. And especially the building sector related activities are by their nature impossible to outsource. So we think that overall at the macro level, the job creation picture will be positive, but we also mindful of the fact that actually a lot of the improvement in the cost efficiency of wind and solar actually came from increasing capital and technology intensity.
Thank you for that. No, that's really important. Let me switch gears a little bit. One of the questions we've also been sort of getting from the audience, and thank you everyone for submitting the questions, and please keep going, is areas where we think the U.S. might be sort of competitive from an export perspective, right? So obviously some of it has been about sort of reducing import dependency, but maybe if either of you wanted to sort of help us understand the technological areas. I think, Laszlo, you've obviously mentioned sort of geothermal. I'm not quite sure whether we would think of that as an export industry as well, but the kind of technologies where it would be a good fit between sort of the American industrial system and opportunities for export versus, say, other major suppliers. Laszlo, I don't know if you wanted to start, and maybe Sarah, turn to you for some thoughts.
So General Electric is an American company which currently manufactures its offshore wind turbines in Europe because that's where the current deployment is. But offshore wind is gathering momentum in the United States, and my expectation is that as offshore wind in the United States gathers momentum, both General Electric and also the European manufacturers will have manufacturing facilities in the United States in the foreseeable future. That's I would be surprised if that didn't happen. But certainly, General Electric has been competing with Siemens for 100 years. They will probably continue to compete for another 100. So it's a neck and neck competition. I think in the car industry, what you see as an interesting dual picture that, of course, Tesla is a global phenomenon. But behind Tesla, the conventional American manufacturers are behind in electrification compared to the conventional European manufacturers. So in the car industry, I think the United States has a superstar and a frankly weaker team, whereas Europe has a team of overall good enough players, but no superstar. This will be an interesting matchup, like Germany versus Brazil in the football World Cup. Now, one thing which is, I think, a big advantage for the United States is that pretty much all the big Silicon Valley tech companies are all in for the energy transition. So the IE has been working with Microsoft, with Google, with Amazon, and all of these companies have very, very aggressive energy transition objectives. And quite importantly, for all of these companies, their activities go way, way beyond just simply buying renewable energy for their own operations. So they have been early investors in some of the most cutting edge, most frontier low carbon technologies, and they have been systematically applying their incredibly strong capabilities on energy innovation as well. And I think that is something which is nearly impossible to replicate. In fact, if you compare the clean energy activities of, let's say, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon with the clean energy activities of the big Chinese tech giants, there is a noticeable gap.
Thank you for that, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's two things I would say. One is we need to think about we shouldn't think about this question just in terms of technology. We should think about it as points in supply chains, right? So the US can actually occupy different points in the supply chains for various technologies. So if we think about this problem 1000% as just a manufacturing question, we're going to put ourselves in a box really fast. There's an important manufacturing component, no doubt. But when you think about what the US can sell to, benefit from economically, benefit from in terms of jobs and those types of things, it can be much more than that. And so, know-how, design, and software, lots of different things that we're good at now, we can continue to do in the realm of different technologies. So, it's not to sidestep the question. I mean, I obviously think some of the things that we've talked about, lithium-ion batteries, electric vehicles, offshore wind, CCUS and DAC. I mean, I think both of those areas are places where the U.S. can do a lot. Hydrogen and energy efficiency technologies that are going to be really important for the building sector. All of these are places where the U.S. has a very viable chance to play a competitive role. I think the second thing to think about too is to sort of put this together and think about where are the places that you both think you want to compete, but two, you do have a strategic and or national security interest to want to occupy space, right? And so I think that there's both of those imperatives in this question about where we decide we want to participate. in what technologies we want to compete in. The other thing too, and I really want to stress this, is we think about competition still on the scale of the market that we're talking about today, where there's only a certain amount of room for a certain amount of players because the market is so big. But if the market were to grow at the rate and pace and scale that we're talking about, there's actually a lot more room. In fact, we run into a whole different host of constraints, which is, do we have enough people? Do we have enough, basic materials? Can we move that fast? All of those types of things. So that's just a few other things that I would suggest we should add when we ask that kind of question.
No, thank you. And bring up the question of scale, as I always think of, the oil industry 150 years ago looks very different than the oil industry of today, right? As you grow, you go to new places, you have new suppliers going in, and that sense of scale, it's worth to remember that we're still at the very early stages of a lot of these technologies. And just because some countries or some issues are there doesn't mean that they're going to be with us forever. We can grow out or change out of them. Laszlo, we have about 10 minutes to go. I wanted to, one of the concepts in our report that we talk about is obviously that shared understanding of energy security. And I would be remiss if I didn't turn to you a little bit for some of the work that is happening at the International Energy Agency, both in terms of the broader outreach to big consuming countries that are not OECD countries, but also your critical work, or sorry, I shouldn't have said critical, your work on critical minerals, that is critical, but that you put out a few weeks ago. So maybe share with us a little bit some of the agenda and the thinking of energy security in a world that is sort of going away from the singular focus on sort of the oil security that we had 50 years ago.
Sure. So for broader energy security, and then I will comment on the critical materials as well. For broader energy security, I think our energy security thinks from the fact that in pretty much every energy transition scenario, including certainly our net zero roadmap, we have a massive scale expansion of the electricity system, which will become a much bigger part of the total energy consumption. So electricity is today maybe 20% of total energy consumption, and this will go up to in our net zero, but to above 50%. So for the electricity system, we designed a work program on 3 pillars. One is expanding the flexibility of the power system to deal with the massive inflow of variable renewables. So this will be electricity market design, grid enhancements, enhancing demand response, storage. The second is the cybersecurity of the electricity system. And the third is the resiliency of the electricity system to extreme weather events, because even with the most ambitious climate policy, there will be a degree of climate impact. And unfortunately, the electricity system is more vulnerable to extreme weather events than pipelines or underground storage facilities. Now, in building this new highly electrified energy system, the demand for what we called the transition minerals. So there we brought together rare earth metals, cobalt, nickel, lithium, even copper. So depending on the application, the demand will grow between 4 times to 40 times. And for pretty much all the minerals, energy equipment will represent a rapidly increasing share of the total global consumption. So for example, nickel is used also in the steel industry, but battery manufacturing will absorb an ever increasing proportion of global nickel demand. And what we identified there is that currently the production is highly concentrated. In some cases, there are legitimate concerns about various labor standards and other social impacts of mining, and also the refining activity of these minerals is also extremely heavily concentrated, and in most cases dominated by metal refining in China. Now, the good news is that we think that there is no geological stopover. So that there is enough lithium, there is enough cobalt, there is enough nickel, but given the exceptionally rapid scale up that the industry needs to achieve, we had a series of recommendations for governments. So one is to promote investment in diversified sources of supply. I mean, there's plenty of lithium in Australia, there is plenty of cobalt in Chile, but investment needs to take place in a timely fashion. So in this respect, just the type of role that Canada and Australia played in the oil and gas industry, that could be played by Australia and Canada and some Latin American countries. We think that there is a scope for technological innovation, both in refining those materials, but also on the demand side. So in some cases, it's difficult to. So, for example, offshore wind turbines are almost certain to continue to rely on rare earth metals. But in other technologies, there are potential innovation areas where we can reduce the reliance of the equipment on rare and difficult to procure materials. Recycling is going to be increasingly important, not only from an environmental point of view, but also from a supply point of view. Supply chain resilience will need to be expanded. In some cases, mining is really not a problem, but refining and further manufacturing is the issue. Now, especially in poor developing countries, so we need to promote higher environmental, social, and governance standards. So initiatives like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative need to be enhanced. But with enhanced cooperation, this can also be a major opportunity, because we actually estimate that in executing the net zero roadmap, in 20 years' time, the market size for these transition minerals will reach $400 billion per year. So this can be actually a very significant development opportunity for some poor developing countries in Africa.
Thank you. And for those of you who have not read that IEA report on critical minerals, I most heartily recommend that you take a look. We only have about 3 minutes to go, so maybe I wanted to open up a big topic, but hopefully get some succinct answers from you. You mentioned electrification, and obviously cybersecurity is one of those areas that we're going to spend more time thinking about. So maybe start with you, Laszlo, and then Sarah, just some thoughts on sort of where we are on the cybersecurity, spectrum in terms of how secure should we feel, and things that we should be doing to improve. So
I think we have a serious issue. And especially in the context of we are moving towards an electricity system, which is going to be multidimensional. So instead of a couple of dozen large conventional power plants feeding the transmission grid, we are going to have hundreds of millions of consumers participating in a more decentralized energy system. Now, of course, there is a rich history of large corporations being hacked. But at least for a large corporation, as a policymaker, I can take a hard line. And I can say that you have to have some proper IT system in place. But when we have 100 million people where my electric car interacts with your solar panels through our mobile phones, I mean, these are real life consumers who are too lazy to download the new version of the firewall and put up the name of their girlfriend as password. And that's just how it is. And I think we need to have systems that are prepared for it. And where I have a bad feeling, and where we had recommendations to our governments, that with a bit of a caricature, what is currently happening is that people like me, the energy community, we are thinking about how the smart, interconnected, efficient energy system should look like. And then we are ready. We take the package and we hand it over to the cyber people, and we tell them that please make this secure. And I don't think this is an appropriate approach. What we have been calling for is that cyber resiliency considerations will have to be embedded into the design of the system from day one, and designed parallelly with the market design and regulatory considerations. And this is a work that should still be undertaken.
Thank you for that. Sarah, the last word to you.
Yeah, just to add to that really quickly, I do think, I think what Laszlo characterized is correct. I also think the energy industry doesn't listen to the cyber industry either, which is they work in a world of managed vulnerability, right? It's not a secure system. Nothing is secure, and we understand that. And so we have to think about what does managed vulnerability look like in the electricity space in this electrified, deeply decarbonized world. The truth of the matter is, Colonial Pipeline, like we've got managed vulnerability today. That's sort of just the world that we've lived in. In the United States in particular, we have a little bit of a problem because we prefer light regulation and low cost. And that is not a world that is conducive to thinking about how you manage vulnerability. And that's an important thing that we're going to have to decide which future we'd like to build towards.
Sarah, thank you. Laszlo, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for tuning in. This was a fantastic conversation. We'll keep at it here at CSIS. You can find the report on our website. So till next time, thank you.